You are listening to the Thoughts from a Page podcast, which is a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network. My name is Cindy Burnett, and I love to talk about books with anyone and everyone. While listening to my podcast, you will hear author interviews, behind-the-scenes conversations about various aspects of the publishing world, theme discussions with other book lovers, and more. For more book recommendations and a complete list of all of my interviews, check out my website, thoughtsfromapage.com, and follow me on Facebook and Instagram at Thoughts From A Page. In 2022, I would love for you to join my Patreon group. I offer at least 2 bonus episodes a month and a monthly advanced read and pre-publication author chat. For those on Facebook, I host a special Patreon Facebook group where we all chat books. Thanks so much to those who already participate, and I hope you will consider joining us. Today, Chanel Cleeton and I are chatting about our last days in Barcelona. Chanel is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of Reese Witherspoon book club pick Next Year in Havana, When We Left Cuba, The Last Train to Key West, and The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. Originally from Florida, Chanel grew up on stories of her family's exodus from Cuba following the events of the Cuban Revolution. Her passion for politics and history continued during her years spent studying in England, where she earned a bachelor's degree in international relations from Richmond, the American International University in London, and a master's degree in global politics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Chanel also received her JD from the University of South Carolina School of Law. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now for a quick break. For the last year, I have been focusing more on my health and eating habits. In connection with that, I have started drinking AG1 in the morning. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my health and energy levels. That is because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. I recommend AG1 to all of my family and friends because the company has a team of doctors and scientists. It is tested for 950 contaminants and is NSF certified for sport. It is formulated based on the latest science, and it maintains high quality standards. Thanks AG1 for sponsoring my show. AG1 is a supplement I trust to provide the support my body needs daily. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. That's drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. Check it out. And now back to my show. Welcome, Chanel. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I'm so happy that you're back. It's really fun to now be doing round 2 with a variety of authors. I just love that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about our last days in Barcelona. Can you give me a quick synopsis for those that won't have read it yet?
Sure. So Our Last Days in Barcelona is a dual timeline, and it's kind of the return of the Perez sisters. So the book fluctuates between 1936 in Barcelona, Spain, and we get to kind of go back in time with the Perez mother, Alicia, and learn a bit about her past. And she's in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War. And then in the 1960s timeline, we travel with Isabel to Barcelona because Beatrice has gotten herself into a situation, and Isabel heads over there in search of her sister. And so it's really a family story and very much kind of a reunion for these characters that really have such a special place in my heart.
And everyone else's heart. As I was on Goodreads, just kind of reviewing the reviews before we hopped on, so many people were thrilled to pieces to visit the Perez family again.
Oh, well, thank you. And I have to say, really this book came from all of the readers who would ask me, when I was going to tell the other sister stories and would ask for more of the Perez family. I hadn't really intended to tell Isabel's story, but it moved me a lot to hear that people had connected with these characters so much and that they wanted more. And that really is what inspired me to write this book.
Oh, I love that. That's interesting that it kind of came from the readers this go round.
Yes, definitely. I think it was a little hard because I had just written When We Left Cuba, kind of when I started conceptualizing this. And with When We Left Cuba, I was so in Beatrice's head. She's one of the Perez sisters, and she and Isabel are definitely the two that kind of are in conflict the most. They're the 2 eldest, and they have personalities that kind of clash. So it was a little difficult to be in her head so much and conceive of telling a story from Isabel's perspective, because so much of it had been kind of, Beatrice a little bit at odds with her sister. But the more I started to think about it and hear from the readers and kind of conceptualize what Isabel's journey would look like and all that she had been through, it really kind of hooked me. And I knew I wanted to delve more into her character.
Was it really fun to do that? And were there things that surprised you about Isabel as you were writing?
It was, I really fell in love with her character. As I kind of alluded to, in the other books, I wasn't as connected to her. I'll just be honest. Beatrice has such a big personality and kind of tends to dominate the story when she's on the page. And so I was so wrapped up in writing her with When We Left Cuba. But when I started Our Last Days in Barcelona and really thought about who Isabel is, what her role is in the family, the kind of responsibilities and sacrifices she's taken on for her siblings, and how much she's really devoted to them, I really began to kind of understand her character better and have such an appreciation for kind of the way in which she goes through her life, and then was able to delve a bit deeper into what are some of her passions and her dreams. I had spent the other 2 books, Next Year in Havana and When We Left Cuba, focusing so much on Elisa and on Beatrice that it was really nice to kind of see Isabel get to be at the forefront of the story and learn that she had passions of her own that, for different reasons she'd kind of had to put by the wayside because of her family obligations and kind of the expectations of her as the eldest sister.
Absolutely. And I enjoyed that their mother was included as well, and we learned more about her.
Yes, she was definitely a fun character to write in the sense that I feel like she's been kind of a mysterious figure, in this series. She's definitely very present and has such a huge influence on her daughter's lives. And at times, they are at odds with their mother, and that has definitely been something that's been a thread throughout the books. And so I wanted to kind of delve back into the experiences that had made her the way that she was, and to kind of give readers a deeper understanding of, how those things have played a role in her life and made her into the character that she is. So I really enjoyed that as well. It was initially not intended to be her story as well as Isabel's. And then as I was working on the book, it just felt so natural because I think, as the eldest, Isabel's life has really been influenced by her mother's expectations and kind of her mother's worries for the family and the sense of responsibility that has been placed on Isabel's shoulders. And so I wanted to explore that relationship a little bit more. And I feel like, in a way, they're kind of the most 2 connected characters in the family in terms of the relationship that they have. And so it just felt very natural to do a dual timeline story and kind of have their experiences play out in tandem.
Do you think it's easier to write a dual timeline story or a story set in one particular time?
That's a great question. And I think it really just depends on the book. The book I just finished that's coming out is just set in one timeline. When We Left Cuba was pretty much just set in one timeline. So I've done both. And I really think it just depends on, what the story demands. I mean, there's definitely benefits to both. Dual timeline can be a bit tricky in terms of knowing when you want to flip between the time periods, when you want to flip between the characters, and also making sure you don't give too much away. I mean, that's definitely one of the challenges because I do tend to have quite a few secrets in my stories and wanting to make sure the reader doesn't get somewhere before they should because they learned something in a timeline that would influence the later one. So there are definitely challenges, but I also think it's nice. One of the things I love about writing historical fiction is kind of the appreciation of how the past informs the present. And I think a dual timeline format kind of beautifully brings that to light for the reader because you see that kind of thread, especially when you're working with a family like this one where, themes of family legacy are really important and kind of carry on from one generation to the next. So I think that in these intergenerational stories, that dual timeline is really useful to be able to employ.
I really enjoyed dual timeline, particularly because of what you just described. I think the past history informs the present. The other tricky thing I think about dual timeline, though you always handle it very well, is tying them together. Because sometimes you'll finish a book and you'll be like, I really like both those timelines, but I don't think they connect very well. And that has to be a tricky part as well.
It is. And, I will be honest with this book, I definitely played with that. I tend to be someone, I don't really plot my stories that much. My editor and agent are really wonderful that I can kind of pitch them an idea and they sort of let me run with it and play with it. And I find that creatively, it comes out best in that process when I kind of have to work with the story a bit and figure out, the mode in which I want to tell it. And as I mentioned, at the onset, originally I was not necessarily planning on putting Alicia's story into the book. It was really more Isabel. But I realized I couldn't tell Isabel's story and all that had influenced her and all that she sort of carried with her without acknowledging her mother's story and how she had been raised with certain expectations and sort of beliefs for herself. And so that's when it really naturally came out, was in that character development. And so then it really organically tied them together because it was such an intrinsic part of Isabel and her growth as a character.
And that's probably when it works the best, when it evolves the way you just described.
I thank you. I hope so. That's always the hope, definitely. But it felt like it worked at that point for sure when I kind of got them into that relationship. And I have another Perez ancestor that I have in as well, who also just tied into the whole kind of family and generation beautifully. She is a granddaughter of one of the characters in The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba. So it was really kind of my evolution of this family and following them throughout different time periods.
Is this the last story that will have the Perez family?
That is a great question. I never say never because obviously I wasn't intending on writing Isabel's story. And then here we are. I do have an idea for a story for Maria. I'm not quite sure, when I would write that one. My next book is not a Perez family story. It does have Cuban characters and has the strong tie to Cuban history, but it does not feature Perez family members. But I have to say, I love this family so much, and they have such a special place in my heart that I'm sure, I'll continue to revisit them in future books and just always kind of revert back to these stories. Because like I said, I feel like this journey of writing historical fiction has been so tied to these characters that it's a really kind of emotional experience for me when I tell their story. Finishing this book definitely felt like I had spent some time with kind of friends or family members. So it was really nice.
And the family clearly resonates with readers.
Well, thank you. No, I have been so just kind of blown away by all of the support that readers have given these characters, and it definitely inspired me to want to tell more stories about them.
So tell me about your research, because you include several pivotal historical moments, and that must have taken some time and effort to research those.
Yes, definitely, I feel like when you're writing historical fiction, everything always kind of starts with the research because even though I don't tend to plot too much, and I have a sketch of an idea when I go into my books, obviously you need the historical details and facts to fit the plot of the story and what you want to do with the story. So often my plot really develops in that research period. And I can look at kind of pivotal story beats and how that's going to influence the characters and the decisions they're going to make and where I'm going to set the story. So definitely, I always spend time before I delve into a book doing a lot of research and really kind of getting, a handle on the framing that I want to use for the story. With this book, what really drew me to this topic in particular came from research that I did for my last book. So my last book, The Most Beautiful Girl in Cuba, was set during the Cuban fight for independence from Spain. And so, I was reading about this very contentious period at the end of the 19th century where Cuba and Spain were locked in this fight for Cuba's independence. And I came across mentions in the, reading about the relationship between Spain and Cuba about how Cubans had volunteered to go to Spain during the Spanish Civil War to fight on the Republican side. And I think it was just kind of an interesting juxtaposition because I had been reading, about this conflict that they were involved in. And then to think, 38 years later, Cubans were going to Spain to volunteer to fight on the Spanish side for the Republicans. I was just really interested by that. My family has been in Cuba for several generations, but my distant, ancestry, they came to Cuba from Spain. And so I've always had kind of, grown up with that appreciation of the Spanish heritage. That's definitely part of my Cuban heritage. And so I wanted to explore that relationship a little bit more. And that was really what sparked my interest in this story. I definitely wanted to keep it kind of focused on Cuban protagonists because the Spanish Civil War is such a sensitive and difficult subject for Spanish people. And I didn't have family in Spain at the time. So I didn't really want to tell the story from that perspective because I didn't feel like that was really my place. But adding kind of the international component in and how many people came and volunteered and how kind of the fight in Cuba and the fight against fascism kind of influenced Cuban politics and the efforts in Cuba to raise money and to kind of raise supplies to help the people of Spain. That was something that I really wanted to focus on and kind of bring out. And then I also think the Spanish Civil War is just such an interesting precursor to World War II, which is often kind of overlooked. And the sense that all of these people came to fight because they realized that there was this international threat of fascism. And so really delving into that a bit more and exploring that.
I've always felt like it was a very interesting time, and I'm not as familiar with it, but I think you're right. Looking at it as a precursor to World War II is definitely important because it is one of the reasons I think that we all entered back into a second war. And so it was interesting to learn more about it. It also really made me think about everything we're going through today with Russia invading Ukraine and those people having to try to find some place to go. I just felt like there were some parallels.
Yes. I mean, that's definitely, I think with each book I write, I always kind of find modern parallels, and it's always kind of disheartening to see how history kind of repeats itself. But definitely, you do see those parallels.
I agree. Well, what surprised you the most about writing this one?
I would say really just how much I kind of fell in love with Isabel and the mother, Alicia. Like I said, they were characters that I had been a bit distant from in my earlier books. And just being in their heads and kind of looking at the world from their perspective and their personalities and what it would have been like to kind of go through, exile and war in that time period as women just really, really moved me. And I found that to be, I think probably the most surprising thing was just how kind of much I fell in love with their characters.
That's interesting. And it probably did surprise you since you felt the most distant from her originally.
Yes. And like I said, I think it was partially because Beatrice is just such a big personality. I mean, when I started writing When We Left Cuba, I kind of always told the story that I didn't mean to write Beatrice's story, but she kind of like pushed her way into my head. And I had the opening scene of When We Left Cuba come into my head when I was writing Next Year in Havana. And I literally had to stop writing Next Year in Havana to write that first scene in When We Left Cuba, because she just, I couldn't not hear her voice. And then had to kind of set that book aside and go back to Next Year in Havana. So I think it was really a lesson in, I always try to kind of put myself in my character's shoes and really relate to them as much as possible. And I think when I had the ability to do that with Isabel, I just admired her strength so much. And also, it was so nice to kind of appreciate the differences in the sisters, just the differences in their personalities, and also how they could come together despite those differences, and how the common bonds between them, the experiences of exile, the love of their family, the loss that they've been through, really bound them together.
Well, and how differently they appeared to you. Beatrice is like pounding on you, tell my story. And you're turning to Isabel and saying, okay, I need to tell your story. Let me figure out what your story is. So it's kind of interesting, really goes with their personalities.
Yes, very much so. Isabel is much quieter, but there's, something really beautiful in her kind of quiet strength. And you realize just how devoted she is to kind of her family and what she believes is right, and the lengths that she'll go to for those things.
And being the oldest child, I'm the oldest child, and I do know that puts you in a position that's different than the other birth order children, because you are the oldest, and a lot of times more is on your shoulders.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that responsibility is definitely something, she feels the weight of, and that, her parents put on her as well. So it's not just something she grapples with.
Absolutely. Well, who was the hardest to write and who was the easiest in this one?
Oh, that's a great question. I have to say they all were kind of easy once they came to me. I feel like I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like something unlocks with characters in the beginning. And there's always that kind of introductory moment where you're like getting to know each other and you're sort of figuring out their quirks and sort of getting inside their head. But then once you kind of unlock, maybe there's like something about their essence, I think it just feels very natural because you really start to kind of view the world through their eyes. And, we spend so much time with our characters when we're writing these books, not just drafting, but edits. And, when you go through excerpts to use for publicity and for events. So really they become like family or friends. I mean, they become kind of fully fledged people in your life in a way because you live with them for so long. So I think once you get past that kind of introductory, figuring out the story and who they are, it really becomes just like you're having a conversation with an old friend.
It's so funny that you say that about them becoming family or friends. And I haven't had this conversation with an author in a while, but I went through a period where several people had mentioned that. And they said even when the book was done, they would find themselves thinking about the character. Like, I wonder what Isabel is doing now. Does that ever happen to you?
It definitely does. And, I would be remiss to not say, too, I have the advantage here of having written, so many other books with them in there. So I definitely came in with, a prior relationship, which could be good and bad because you had some preconceptions or maybe, some instincts or kind of impressions that came from other characters because you were in their heads. But, having written these characters for so many books, I think that did give me kind of the advantage of knowing who they were and kind of knowing their backstory and then being able to jump into the story a little bit more quickly. And that's part of why, I have continued to revisit these characters, is because they do sort of tug on your heartstrings, and you think, okay, a few years have passed. What would they be doing now? How would their lives have evolved? And certainly, when I mentioned I have that idea for Maria, that's a little bit the case as well. It was kind of, as I was writing Isabel's story, I was like, oh, well, actually, this could be a future path for Maria that she could go down. So they do stick with you. It's hard to let go sometimes because you are so invested in the characters and their stories.
Well, and as you're writing them and you're learning more about them, do you do that through just sitting down and writing the book? Or do you do a period of time where you sit down and say, okay, let me brainstorm about Isabel and make notes about her? Or is it just a straight through writing process?
It's really just the straight through writing process for me. I've tried doing, and I know some authors do really like doing kind of character mapping and they'll go through kind of extensive questionnaires with their characters. I've tried that. I find that the best thing for me is just in the story. Like if I just start writing and kind of see where the story takes me, if a situation pops up, and then I have to kind of say, well, how would Isabel respond to this? That really kind of helps me. And I think too, the fact that I write in first person helps me feel like I'm really directly in their head. It's almost like their thoughts become my thoughts become their thoughts. So you kind of feel that immediate connection just in the way it comes out on the page, because it is first person.
You're just really inhabiting the characters' lives.
Yes. I mean, I think so. It's kind of like you feel as though you're kind of going on the journey with them.
Oh, I like that. That's a good way to put it. Chanel, you always end up with the best covers, and I love seeing what your latest book is going to look like. Can you tell me how this cover came about? And also your titles. I think it's so interesting to see what goes into a title, and I'd love to hear more about that.
So thank you so much for the covers. I mean, I, of course, cannot take credit for it. The Berkeley Art Department always does the most amazing job. And, I always kind of laugh because with each cover, I've loved all of them. So the bar gets a little bit higher. And yet they always, just blow me away with what they come up with. And I think each most recent cover is always my favorite of all my covers. So that's been a really wonderful thing to be surprised with and to experience. With the cover, I think about a year ago, maybe a little bit more now, it usually starts with an introductory conversation with my editor. And, we just go over kind of character details, traits, appearances. She'll kind of ask me for any ideas I have on the cover. I will be completely honest. And I always say this, I am not gifted in that area. Like I just don't visualize things artistically. So I kind of offer my little hints, but really it's the art department just so beautifully kind of brings my books to life, and their vision always really feels like it's just spot on for the characters and the story. And so this was another instance where I was just really grateful. We do usually go through a few covers and you kind of can go back and forth a bit. So it's really nice to be able to give my input. And I think they always really want something that I'm happy with. And I've always just been so thrilled with the beautiful covers that they've created. And then with the title, we did go back and forth a little bit with this one. I will be honest, titles probably, you asked me which character was the hardest to write for me. I would say the hardest part of the publishing process is almost always titles for me. It just, some come easily, but it's a little bit challenging to kind of condense your novel into a short title. And then you want to do something that hasn't been used already. And when you kind of have so many connected books like I do, where a lot of them feature place names, there tends to be kind of an enthusiasm to put a place name into it, which adds kind of another layer of complexity to coming up with something. But this one, we just kind of went back and forth, and it felt like it fit the story. I wanted to highlight the setting so readers kind of knew where we were going to be in the timeline. I mean, there is a setting that takes place in Cuba with Rosa, the Perez cousin, and there's little bits of Isabel in the United States as well. But really wanted to kind of highlight the fact that the dual timeline is in Barcelona for these characters. And then, just felt like it kind of fit the spirit of both timelines in terms of how influential this time spent in Barcelona was for the two characters.
I can't believe after all of your books that I have read and paid attention to the titles and covers, I never made the connection that most of them or all of them have a place name in the title. Isn't that funny? It just didn't occur to me, but I love that.
Aw, well, I'm glad you like it. Thank you. No, it wasn't intentional, but it's kind of like once it starts,
right.
It kind of takes off and has a little bit of a life of its own. So yes, that is something we've kind of gone with. But I think it's, nice to have kind of the cohesive thread when you have the Perez family to kind of know, the titles are somewhat similar and kind of play off of each other.
Absolutely. So now they're going to be telling you, okay, you need to write about someplace else because we have to use it in the title. You're like, no, I'm set on Cuba. Do you want to talk a little bit about your next book?
Sure. I will talk a little bit about it. I just turned it in to my editor. Just my first draft to her. So waiting on edits and everything, but it will probably be out in May next year. We do have a title, but I probably am not allowed to share it. So it is set in 1934 and it is set on a cruise ship. So it's a real ship. It was called the Morro Castle and it sailed from New York to Havana and back again. And tragedy struck the ship in 1934. So this one has two protagonists and there are passengers on the ship and they both kind of have a lot of secrets and there's a lot of kind of subterfuge going on in this book. So it was really interesting to write it. Definitely one of my more action-packed books and I really enjoyed kind of getting to go through that. So I'm excited to share it with everyone and to see covers and kind of move forward with that process. So it's definitely... it's always fun to be able to kind of delve into other time periods and other worlds and to learn more. I mean, the story of the ship is really pretty incredible and very sad, circumstances that happened to it. And it wasn't something I really knew much about until I started researching what my next book was going to be. So it was just a really interesting journey kind of going through the path. And I'm just really excited to share it with everyone.
That sounds really good. I'm already excited.
Oh, well, thank you. And sorry, I'm always a little vague because I don't want to give away too much that's spoilery. So I always have to be careful. But yeah, that's what the next one is. So,
well, what about what you've read recently that you really liked?
So I've read some amazing historical fiction arcs for books that are coming out soon. That's always one of the best parts of the job. I love to read and love getting to kind of see sneak peeks of these books. One that I really loved that I just finished was The Winter Orphans by Kristen Beck. And that one is coming out in September, I believe. I read her debut, Courage, My Love, and really loved that book. So I was really excited to read her follow-up. And this one is set during the evacuation of Jewish children by the Swiss Red Cross in Nazi-occupied France. And so it's a really powerful story, really emotional and just very beautifully told. So I really recommend that one. And then I also read Sister Mother Warrior by Vanessa Riley. And I believe that one is out in July, I think. And that one is a story of the Haitian Revolution from the perspective of two real-life figures, Grand Toya, who was a West African warrior, and Marie Claire Bonheur, who was the first Empress of Haiti. And it's just this really powerful story of their roles and in the Haitian Revolution. So that one is really beautiful. I love Vanessa's writing. She wrote Island Queen, which is amazing. So I highly recommend her new one as well. It's sitting on my bedside table and I cannot wait to get to it. I love her writing as well. Yes, no, it was amazing. I really I felt like I learned so much and it was such a powerful story. So I think you'll really enjoy that one. Okay, good. Well, Chanel, thank you so much for joining me today on the Thoughts from a Page podcast. I always enjoy speaking with you. Oh, thank you so much for having me. I always love being here. I really appreciate it.
I'm Allison Holland, host of the Kennedy Dynasty podcast. Equipped with a microphone and a long-term fascination of the Kennedy family, I am joined by an incredible cast of experts, friends, and guests to take you on a fun, relaxed, yet informative journey through history and pop culture. From book references to fashion to philanthropy to our modern expectations of the presidency itself, you'll see that there is so much more to Kennedy than just JFK or conspiracy theories. Join me for the Kennedy Dynasty podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you like this episode, and I hope you did, please follow me on Instagram at Thoughts From a Page. Consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. Tell all of your friends about the show and rate it or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
Women's Running Stories, where we explore the intersection between running and life. Because every woman who is committed to a running journey has a story to tell, and this is where you'll find those stories. I am host and producer Cherie Louise Turner. I'm a 53-year-old runner, and together with original music by musician and runner Cormac O'Regan, we bring these inspirational stories to life. Please join us to fuel your adventures.